The essence of these 6 lessons was about how do you get the basics right? And then the digital, the AI tools all really help. So think about the basics of running your services. How do you get your services, your offering, if you've got COEs, how's that offering? How does it really meet the needs of your customers? When you've got it as simple as you possibly can and you've got it organized, and how are you continuously improving? So this is, think about the basics, then all the digital tools can really help you.
Hey, welcome to Revolutionizing Business Operations with Tony Saldanha. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on something that the GBS community rarely gets, the unvarnished, hard-won lessons from somebody that's actually built 4 world-class GBS organizations from scratch. That's Phil Priest, head of global business services at Rolls-Royce, a FTSE top 15 company, and a company that's in the midst of one of the most remarkable corporate transformations in recent British business history. Phil, always a pleasure to speak with you. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Tony. Good to talk to you today. And a great subject to talk about. Some lessons I've learned along the way, I guess, and that you don't find in playbooks.
You certainly don't. Phil, by the way, is going to share 6 leadership lessons that GBS leaders learn the hard way. Phil, I'm really excited for us to talk about this. But before we jump into this, I want to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself.
Yeah, I mean, my career is manufacturing and supply chain management for a long time. I guess the latter part, for the last 15 years or so of my career, I got into GBSs. I was part of building 6 centers for GlaxoSmithKline. Went to a company called Smith & Nephew, a UK medical devices company, built their GBS from scratch, which is a very, very broad GBS. And since I left, the team there have taken it on, and it's a really strong, well-known GBS. Actually, the highlight there was that we started building that GBS with customer experience. Before everybody was talking about customer experience, we led with customer experience, knowing that it would create pull in the organization. Then I went to a company called IFF, where we had some challenges because of the challenges retail had a few years ago, and managed to strengthen some centers in Bangalore, change around a center in Budapest, and enhance a center in Mexico. So really, really interesting model. And a really strong European center headed out of Asturias in northern Spain, not a place you'd normally expect to see centers. And then I came to Rolls-Royce, and the CEO of Rolls-Royce had a massive transformation strategy, and my job was rewrite the strategy for GBS, clean sheet, and then get on with implementing that strategy, which we've been doing now for the past couple of years. So that's my history. So look, build from scratch, reboot, a bit of both, all in the mix. Yeah,
that is so true. Since you've been across various sectors here, it's like very different organizations: life sciences, consumer packaged goods, chemicals, aerospace. Does the sector really matter to a GBS leader?
Not really. Margin makes a difference to investment sometimes, but if you've got a good strategy, it's got a good business case, you get the investment. And it's important that you think about the business case for GBS, and it's never just about efficiency. The CEO and the CFO will look to generate efficiency from a GBS for sure, but the rest of the organization wants a bit more than that. And maybe that's something we can talk about a little bit more as we chat today, Tony.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's jump into the topic of 6 leadership lessons. Once again, when I first heard about this, what I was impressed by is the practitioner perspective, because this comes from somebody that's actually had to do this the hard way, roll up their sleeves and actually build GBS organizations. This isn't something that you would get from a research paper. And it's incredibly valuable to upcoming GBS leaders. Now, you've condensed this, I suspect, over a period of your career. But before we actually jump into the 6, was there something that triggered the need to create these?
Yeah, there was, Tony. It was actually a conversation with a couple of conference owners, so the SSON team, and also actually a conversation with a couple of others that run conferences. And they were talking about the topic of every conference these days is AI and Gen AI and what can it do for you. And I said, hang on, there's some basic lessons that still apply. And they said to me, Phil, so what do you mean basic lessons apply? So, well, there's a few basic things that I've learned over the years that still are relevant in the age of AI. And that was what really caused me to think about these sort of things. In 4 jobs over 15 years, trying to sort out very successful GBSs.
Yes, I'm truly glad that you've done this, Phil. So let's do this. Maybe let me flash up the 6 leadership lessons so our viewers that are watching this over video can get a glimpse at all of them. And then what I'm going to do, Phil, is I'll walk you through 1 or 2 questions on each of the 6. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
All right, so let's do this. I'm going to share here.
Totally, it's on the screen.
Okay, very good. So building the GPS engine, lessons you won't find in the playbook. Phil, tell us about these 6.
Yeah, I'll quickly flash across the 6. So number 1 was don't believe labor arbitrage is dead. In this world of AI, digital, yes, you can do fantastic things with it. You can improve the performance of services that you deliver. You can use them in centers of excellence, but actually still, can you get good people in a high quality, lower cost location? You can. If I look at the survey that was published by ABSL in Poland at the beginning of last year, and I think this year's will be out soon, it still showed there's a significant labor arbitrage in Poland versus my home country, the UK, or indeed even more US. So that was one. People matter. They absolutely matter in this game. And my wife's favorite chapter of her favorite book is How to Become a Great Boss, written by Jeffrey Fox. And there's one chapter in that book that says 7s hire 5s, 9s hire 10s. Have you got 9s and 10s leaders? Are they hiring 9s and 10s people? The third one is there's a joke out there, maybe not quite this season because this season's been a bit crazy, but GBS leaders lose their jobs faster than most Premier League managers. I think the cycle of GBS leaders changing role has got faster, just like it has in the Premier League, but not quite as crazy as the Premier League. But quite often, we talk about efficiency and being the job of a GBS leader. Quite often you don't get fired for not delivering efficiency. You get fired for the noise that happens because the services don't perform to the standard expected. Then lesson 4, global process owners. Some processes are very large. If you think about the quote to cash process, it's impossible to own the end-to-end process. It starts deep in a commercial organization in sales, marketing, and it finishes with you allocating some cash. If you're in a finance organization, to own every bit of that process is not possible. So how to become great influencers? How do we influence processes and how do we make them better? A lot of people talk to me about what's the difference between a GBS and a shared service. That's pretty simple, really. A GBS without service management is just a collection of individual shared services. Service management is the wrapper that brings it all together. And there's a lot in that, including the service design. And then the final lesson, as we evolve and we've gone through shared service centers, we're now into global capability centers. I'm sure there'll be another iteration of it. But what that's all about really is if you're not growing, you're dying. If you just operate a bunch of shared services, you optimize them, you put good digital tools on them, and you run them really well, then everyone in the organization is looking what's next, because what can GBS deliver beyond that? And then we have to start looking at capabilities as a service and other things that drive us up the value chain.
Yes, and it's such an evolving industry that if you're not able to evolve along with it, then you got a major problem. So I think these are incredible, Phil. And I want to go back and start with the first one because I think that this point about labor arbitrage is misunderstood. I've often put myself in the shoes of somebody that's starting their career in the Philippines or India or Poland. And usually these are people that come up through a very competitive education system. They've got aspirations. They don't really want to spend the rest of their lives doing data entry or some low-end, cheap labor type of work. And what is happening in many of these industries is that their work is being automated. So they are forced to move up the value chain, right? So the game, I believe, as you've accurately pointed out, is no longer taking the basic stuff, the repetitive, scalable stuff, and moving it to another country for somebody to do the same thing over and over again. But the game is about how do you automate the things that you can automate and then move up the value chain. And so you can actually start to do that and get higher order skills at lower costs. So it's no longer about data entry or transaction management work at lower cost. It's about higher level skills at lower cost. So I was really intrigued to listen to you talk about this. What's been your experience? What's happening here?
If you think of the sort of traditional onshore locations that have gone to go offshore, whether you're in the UK or one of the bigger European countries or the US, a typically developed large economy. And then you look across today, where are all the experts? If you want to bring in high quality entry level staff and develop them to come through in your finance or your procurement organization, or typically those people are hard to find now in onshore locations. And then because our industry's been around a long time now in these locations, they've gone through 3, 4, or 5 iterations of how you drive a better process.
Yeah.
So they're more well equipped to understand how you could put digital onto things. So I think that's where the experts are now. So the experts in process transformation aren't all onshore. They're typically in places like Poland or the Czech Republic, or the places where you see the growth of shared service centers historically have now gone through several iterations. So that's where I'd go for the expert. Those experts are still a lot cheaper than experts onshore because they're already plentiful.
And the fact that this is one of those myths that it's all about the cheap labor is something that somebody like yourself that's been through 4 iterations of this, you've not just seen this for yourself, but you found a way to leverage the higher order skills at a fraction of the cost as a result of this. The second key lesson around underestimating people is also one that I love, because I think that it makes sense for GBS leaders to sometimes hire slightly overqualified people because the work is not static. You're not going to hire somebody and have them do the same thing for the rest of their lives. So you're looking for somebody that's a constant learner. What's been your experience here?
Yeah, I think there's 2 things in this that are quite interesting. The one is about, I talked about this 7s hire 5s, 9s hire 10s. You hire great leaders. There's a whole cadre of people that they know that are great people, that do their job really well and are capable of learning more. So I think one part of it is about great leaders attract really good people. And if you've got really good people working in a way that are supported, empowered, not afraid to test things in a controlled way and not afraid to push boundaries, then you get much more out of the population and they're more fulfilled by the job.
Yes.
I think there's a really interesting thing that came out quite a few years ago. In one of the centers, I had a center head that came from the BPO world, and she taught me that we should look at training our people for the next job constantly. We should have a constant succession plan. And it was in the times when we were seeing very high attrition rates. And she said, well, they don't leave if you promote them.
Yes.
They leave if you don't. So when you spot really good people in the organization, how do you help them in their path through your organization? And it's a very interesting time because that company, we weren't a global brand like Rolls-Royce. We didn't have a global brand that was recognizable by anybody. When we entered into a new market with a new center, we had to pay absolutely top rates in the market. And we were hiring some really good people, but we were relatively expensive to some of the other centers when we started to benchmark. We put this process in place of developing the people to be able to do the next job and the next job. And when you hire really, really great people at the top of the house and you pay top rates for them, you know that if they don't get any further development, then they're going to leave. And some of our leaders would help us set it up, but then they'd move on to the next piece of our career. But when you've got 6 levels of hierarchy, and a leader leaves and you can then promote 5 people and hire somebody new to join the organization in a development role, when you do that, people stay. Because 5 people get a promotion when 1 leaves. So this whole concept of hire really great leaders who come and help you for a period of 2, 3, 4 years, help them get a much better job, a much bigger job,
Yeah.
and then they create 5 vacancies. And the really interesting thing was when you move within a company, quite often you don't get as big a pay rise as you move from one company to another.
Yes.
And what
Yes.
we
Yes.
noticed with that center 3, 4 years after we'd started it, the average salary by grade wasn't that much higher than the starting salary we put in, yet we had loads of great people in there and they wanted to stay because they were getting promotions. Really quite interesting.
That is interesting. The point about providing a career path is absolutely critical because I remember a study that I had done about 8 years ago or so, and I found that the reason most people leave SSC, shared service centers, is actually not about money. They get tired of the role, they want to learn, they want to grow, and they're not seeing it.
Yeah.
And that's when they leave. That's when it becomes a commodity. Somebody's giving me some more exciting work, I might as well take it. So this is, again, a really important lesson because career pathing isn't just about money, it is also about opportunities. Job rotations, perhaps international development opportunities, spending 6 months, a year, 2 years in a development assignment at the headquarters, job rotation into the functions and the business units. All of that, when you put that together, as you have done, is such a powerful construct. Now, I'm going to move to the third one, which um, is is um, is obviously a joke with some basis in fact, which is GBS managers lose their jobs very frequently. Your point is that while it's not because they're not delivering results, it's how they're delivering results.
There is a cadre of companies that bring GBS leaders in just to generate efficiency, right? So cost to operate. But if you only deliver cost to operate, you typically don't succeed.
Yeah.
For me, I think about 3 E's: efficiency, effectiveness, and experience.
Yeah.
And if efficiency is table stakes, when you come to a GBS role, that's just an expectation and you have to
It's the
deliver.
price
But
of entry. Yeah.
when you start to mature, you have to think about other things. And the term effectiveness to me is, what do you give the organization? What do you enable the organization to do? The value creation pieces of an organization.
Yes.
Typically, a lot of shared services aren't actually the true value creators. They don't make anything, they don't develop anything, they don't
Yeah.
sell anything, they don't service anything in the aftermarket, as the case of we do in Rolls-Royce. We have aftermarket services. But you support that organization. If you can give that organization more time to be able to
Yeah.
do their task, you solve their problems really quickly, first time resolution. You find the easiest way for them to get help or to have their request serviced. And that's back into thinking about the service management offering and
Yes.
how do you work
Yes.
and
Yes.
how do you deliver an easy way. But a lot of times you hear people talk about self-service. Self-service creates an awful lot of noise in the market.
Yeah.
With your customers, lots of
Yeah.
noise.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Certainly if you're moving complexity to them as a
yeah,
way to get efficiency inside a GBS, that can create noise.
but if you think about it this way, if it's the fastest way that they can get a resolution to their problem
There you go.
quickly,
Yes.
then self-service is the quickest go there. You won't
Yes.
have to force self-service. So self-service is often termed a bad word. Self-service is good when it's the fastest way to get the value creators.
When it is done correctly. Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yes.
And then there's this third thing about customer experience. For me, customer experience, Tony and I, we go back a long time. We judge
Yeah, we're co-judges on this for a long time now.
and when you start measuring things like Net Promoter Score, it's 2 bits of experience. There's the experience someone has when you've just closed a ticket for them. You've serviced their request or you've solved a problem. And that's usually quite a high score because you've just solved their problem. You've just serviced their request. But if you think about it, after the event surveys, typically the Net Promoter Score goes much lower.
Yes.
So one of the companies we judged a year ago, Tony, they had an 85% Net Promoter Score on ticket closure. They had a 30% Net Promoter Score and after the event surveys.
Yeah.
I dug a little bit with that company after the awards and was chatting. We talked about this. How do you think about immaculate recovery? If you think about when you buy a car, you go to a garage, you buy a brand new car, and then something goes wrong with it. But that garage is amazing with you. They come and pick it up. They give you a loaner car. They call you about it. They get it fixed. They give you it back. They give you a really good experience. You'll go buy another car from them. Yeah. It's a bit like that. So after the event, when we fail, and no one's ever perfect, when we fail, how do we recover immaculately? So when they
Yeah.
remember us, they don't remember us for the failure, they remember us for the recovery.
Yes.
And in that way, GBS leaders can be more enduring because they get fired usually because the noise in the
Yes. The
organization
noise levels. Yes.
about how bad this is.
Yes.
And that's really quite an interesting problem. The other thing I always notice about this is when you first move a role, you might do a lift and shift. If
Yes.
you do a lift and shift, all of a sudden, all the problems of that role suddenly surface because everybody's pointing out what you don't do correctly.
Yes. Yeah. Because I used to do it much better. Now you've taken it and then, yeah, you've screwed it
Yeah.
up. Yes.
Now you've got it offshore, and I can't walk down the corridor and get somebody to fix it the
Exactly.
bad way I used to fix it. I
Yeah.
have to call you to fix
Yeah.
it. But if you think about that noise, to a leader, that's gold dust because that noise is telling you all the things that you need to fix about that process you didn't know
There you
before
go.
you got it. It's
Yes.
really quite. So I'm thinking about those things prevent you losing your job as a GBS leader and help you succeed.
That's a very pragmatic way to look at this. The fact of the matter is that GBS leaders are in the industry of change leadership. And anytime you drive change, there is going to be some noise. But are you looking at it more than just efficiency? Are you looking at the noise as a source of continuous improvement?
Yeah.
And I think this is some of the points that you're making around effectiveness and experience that goes way beyond what most traditional GBS leaders do. I want to move to the next one, which is global process owners. This is another misunderstood areas. What I found is that lower maturity GBS leaders think of GPOs as the people that will solve a lot of problems. They'll tell them what the standards are and bring in the mandates, and then GBS can execute. Obviously, what you're saying here is no, that's not the way it should work.
Yeah. Look, global process owners is a misnomer. You cannot own every bit of a global process end to end. Geographically, complexity of the end to end process is too large. You can merely influence it.
Yes.
And actually, the best global process influencers are usually the best people who are good at change management.
Yes. Yes.
They can diagnose, they can design, they can think about implementation, they think about how the changes that they implement stick. Because in that 4 phases of redesign of a process, you've got to have good diagnosis. But actually, you've got to have good change management. You've got to create a cadre of people who are willing to change what they do. But then when you design it, you've got to co-design it with the people who operate it. Because if you don't co-design, you don't take them with you.
Correct.
Then when you implement it, they're ready for implementation. So they're not pushing back on you. They're agreeing with you because you co-designed it with them and the implementation goes better. People have habits. So after implementation, you have to keep going back and reinforcing the new process because if you don't, they'll just go back to doing it the way they did. And they say this thing about if you do the same thing every day for a month, it becomes a habit, right? So you've got to make sure every day they're doing the same thing for a month or two to get that new process embedded. So that's one big thing. So you've got to be an excellent change manager because you're dealing with
Yes.
people who want to do the process the way they've always done it or the way they like doing it, and you want them to change to do it a different way. That's a change management challenge. And it's also a challenge with stakeholders who might want their bit of the process to be done like that, even if you have diagnosed it and found a different way of doing it, a better way of doing it. So you've got to work with them as well. So I think this notion of global process influencers should be the way we think about
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is I've used process mining tools many times. They give you a lovely map of all the mess your process is. How do you deal with it? You deal with the outliers because the outliers create noise that get you sacked on the last level. Reducing the outliers so you get closer and closer to the core. Then you really drive standardization of the process. Then you adopt a more common approach to the process by just removing outliers. It really is a different way of looking at it. But you have to have global process owners, but how do they really
Yeah. What do they do? I think the paradigm shift here is rather than looking at global process owners as the be all and end all, they're going to define the standards and everybody in the world is going to follow them. You start to look at them very pragmatically, as you said, as influencers that are working along with you, the GBS leaders, to drive the three things you talked about: efficiency, effectiveness, and experience. And some of this they're going to be able to control because it belongs in their functions. And other pieces of work are in adjacent functions And they're going to try their best, but they're going to struggle with it. And then back to the point around there's always the exceptions to the process and how do they handle it. And that's a very different job than designing the workflow for the process on paper. This is an industry insight that has a lot of legs, Phil. Maybe we should do a deep dive on this, but it's also a good link to the next lesson, which is service management. By the way, this one is one of my favorites because it goes back to a core insight that I've learned and I've led throughout my GBS career, which is that the best GBS organizations are run as if they were a business. Meaning, if you were a business, you would not just be complacent about delivering my orders. You would also look to innovate. You would also look to figure out who's my competition. You'd look to figure out what's your cost structure, your experience structure, and so on and so forth. And all of that is obviously service management. So tell me a little more about how you've come about this insight around service management being a core strategy.
It all started with looking at ITIL and
Yes.
management. And when you think about it, you have incident, problem. You start off with those simple basics of when you have an incident, do you look at multiple incidents all then becoming a problem, and then do you do problem management and root cause problem solving? And then how do you orchestrate the service? So how do you then serve better? And how do you do change management of your processes? And then you start to go wider and think about data management and overall performance management. And then in an IT organization, you have demand management and supply management. It's the same.
Exactly.
In a GBS organization, have demand. The demand comes from an ongoing request, please pay all my invoices, or a very urgent request, which might be, we've got this non-PO invoice that we need paying really quickly because it's a government payment that we have to make. That's an ad hoc request. Or then we've got a problem, like this invoice doesn't have a PO, or this we haven't received the goods. We've got problems to solve. And that all creates demand on the organization.
Correct.
And you have to know what your supply is. And then the other interesting thing for me is I'm not really a lover of the individual functions marking their own homework. Who's the one that keeps the score, really? And if you start at the basic premise of everything comes through a workflow or a ticket, or those workflows, how are they executed on time? Your service management organization can see them all. So how many times do we reopen a ticket? How long is the ticket open before someone's answers on that ticket? How many times does a search fail to find something in your knowledge base? How often does somebody go into your knowledge base and then still put a ticket on because they can't get the resolution? A service management organization can watching all that data, can be reporting all that data. You can be very data driven. Then if you know what your demand management is, your supply management, you know what your failure modes are, all from the data that a service management organization collects for you, you can design for success and drive continuous improvement programs in the right places. For me, I was taught a long time ago when I did my black belt, a Lean Six Sigma black belt. I haven't kept up my certification. I wished I had, but I still remember all the principles. And somebody once said to me, if you're solving your biggest problems first, by definition, you're moving at the fastest possible rate.
Correct.
The key to the service management organization tells you what your biggest problems are. Therefore, that's where you focus your problem management. You do proper root cause, and our 5-step problem solving processes are typical in my ex-organizations because that's what I've learned in my lean days. And then you really implement a solution. So you go that diagnose, design, implement, embed loop that we talked about earlier. You put that in place, then you drive continuous improvement in your operations, and you eliminate the reason somebody has to call you, or you minimize the amount of time it takes to go through a request process.
Absolutely. It is, because it does 3 things. One is it looks at outcomes, not just in terms of the first step in the process, but to end-to-end outcomes. But the second thing it does is it actually generates the source of root causing and continuous improvement that drives the upward spiral. And then the third thing is it constantly helps you to move up the value chain, because when you're solving the biggest problems, when you're asking root causes, you're also generating conversations with your functions and the business units about things that are upstream that may be causing problems here. And those are innovation ideas. So I think it actually helps you as a GBS leader expand the work that you do, which then brings us to that last most important lesson, which is about growth. If you're not growing, you're dying. I think this is one that we would all agree with, given the state of our industry in GBS.
It really started from thinking of a quite mature GBS. So one of the roles I had was to start something from scratch, and over the 6 or so years I was there, we really matured it a long way. We took it from a benchmark that was pretty poor to a benchmark that was world class, and right at the top of world class at one point. And then we started saying, where do we go next? And we'd probably got a lot of the cost out of those processes. We hadn't spent an awful lot of money on IT. We knew there was some digital and enhancements to do, but some of those were changing an ERP is quite costly, right? And there's not always a great return from changing an ERP. And we started saying we're probably maximizing out what we can do in our existing organization. Where do we go for new value? And it was about the time when GCC started to be thought about. So we were thinking, well, let's go to centers of excellence that, and I've seen centers of excellence created for tax and treasury and a whole pile of things. And then new sources of growth, but new sources of value for your corporation. You have to think about how you create value for your corporation. Yeah. And value goes beyond efficiency when you start to get much further. Then you're thinking about where are those sources of value, and maybe that's another session we could do another time, Tony, about thinking about where sources of value.
I think there is a lot to be unpacked on the value thing. In my own experience, GBS organizations that look at value creation holistically deliver 3x, meaning 3 times more value in terms of total shareholder return, or if you happen to be a government entity or a nonprofit, there may be other metrics for value. But the ratio holds, which is you can deliver 3 times more value if you focus on value creation on end-to-end effectiveness and experience, back to your framework, than if you just focus on efficiency. So let's park that one I suspect, Phil, we're going to have a few more of these so we can actually go deeper into some of these insightful topics. But for the moment, let's land this one. So as you think about your own role in the industry, of having spent a few decades in here and learned a lot, and now starting to distill this to lessons that can be picked up by other leaders, is there one message you want to leave a new GBS leader on their first assignment?
Yeah, the essence of these 6 lessons was about how do you get the basics right? And then the digital, the AI tools all really help. So think about the basics of running your services. How do you get your services, your offering, if you've got COEs, how's that offering? How does it really meet the needs of your customers? When you've got it as simple as you possibly can and you've got it organized, and how are you continuously improving? So this is, think about the basics. Then all the digital tools can really help you, but until you get the basics right, they don't help you. Yeah.
That is so true. Hey, Phil, I need to say, this has been exactly what our listeners needed. Not only a success story, but also a real practical list of lessons on how they can be successful. For our listeners, the message is clear. The difference between a good GBS and a world-class one is rarely about the technology. It's rarely about the AI or the tools or the organization chart. It's about what you as a leader know and what you're willing to say out loud. Phil has been willing to say it today, and I hope it saves you years of learning the hard way. Phil, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to have you here.
Pleasure to share my story a little bit.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And to our audience, thank you for listening to Revolutionizing Business Operations with Tony Saldanha. Until next time, keep revolutionizing your operations. This is Tony Saldanha.